commands a very large audience in the US. His weekly letter have a subscription base of 1 million, and it's served from the company Mauldin Economics. 4 of his books have been on the New York Times bestseller list. The last and best known is called Endgame. John is a popular expert commentator for both CNBC and Bloomberg Television. Welcome, John.
I'm really happy to be here. I feel at home in Norway because I sense kind of the same spirit as I came from in Texas. Now, you know, you don't have cattle everywhere and there's not big boots, but it's that same can-do attitude. It's that we can do whatever we feel like doing and we can get it done. I like that spirit of looking out and entrepreneurship and business, and it makes me feel good. And I noticed last night that the Danes are a little sensitive about this, because they were talking to me, because when I mentioned that I was going to Norway, they said, yeah, they got all the oil and they stole it from us. And I got, well, wait a minute, I thought the Danes were the kings. I mean, I missed that part of history where they stole. He says, no, they got our guy drunk and they took it all. And so that was their theory of why you guys are rich and they're not. So I thought it was just interesting. That's pretty much what the rest of California says about Texas too. You know, that they say we're stealing all their businesses, and no, they just want to come. We don't even have to get Californians drunk to come to Texas. Thank you very, very much, Tor, for inviting me. This is a great honor to be here. Today, we're going to look at a longer-term time frame. I've been thinking about, I've always thought about the future and how we get from where we are today to where we're going. I did a TV interview in Denmark. The first few hours I was there, they took me from the airport to the TV station. And the next day I looked online and they sent me a link, and it said, in describing me in Danish, and I couldn't, of course, read that, except I understood the word pessimistica. And I don't know, I guess that translates into Norwegian. And I wanted to go, but wait, I'm not a pessimist. I mean, all the time people are telling me I'm bearish, or that, you know, I'm doom and gloom, and I am not. I'm the most irrational optimist in the room. I am so excited about the future. I mean, I really believe we're going into a world of abundance, a world where we're going to see miracles of technology. Cancer will be cured. Maybe this year I'll be talking about that here in just a little bit. It's just governments that I'm bearish about. And I think for good reason. So I would like to call myself a realistic optimist, because I recognize that some things are unsustainable. And Stein said way back when, if something can't continue, then it will stop. Okay? Makes sense? Well, I want to take that a little bit further and say, if something is unsustainable, then it will change. And I think that this is the year that we're going to start seeing the transition from unsustainable to sustainable. Let's go back to 2001. Lenin told us that there are decades when nothing happens and that there are weeks when decades happen. In 2001, we saw China enter the World Trade Organization. The euro was inaugurated, and we had 9/11. All of those things are impacting us today. One of the great things that happened in Norway was that you didn't join the euro. Aren't you happy? Is way back in 2003 when I was writing my second book, I was talking about people saying, well, what currency do you want to be long? Where do you want to go? And I said, the Norwegian kroner. And people would go, where's Norway first? And then why would you want to be, you know, the problem is that you guys, if you were big enough, you would be the world's reserve currency. Because everybody would want your currency. And why? Because you have a sustainable government. Now, some of us think your taxes are too high. That's okay. It works. You have taxes, you have spending, they roughly balance. I mean, that's sustainable. And if you wanted to tax yourself 75% and that's what you spent, that's fine. It's when you start taxing yourself 40% and you're spending 50%, that's when you get in trouble. Ask the French. Now, unsustainability. If something cannot be sustained, it will change. What is unsustainable? It's a world in which expenses rise faster than income. In your business, if you start spending more than you're taking in, eventually the bank's going to come and call your notes. People are going to stop sending you product. You're out of business. It's unsustainable. You're going to have to change. You're going to have to reduce your expenses or increase your income. Whether that's your family or your government, that's the rules. Now, what's unsustainable? Confidence. That's what makes the United States able to raise all the money, and yet Argentina couldn't raise a fraction of that in terms of percentage. Why did Russia, at a small percentage of debt, with rich natural resources, why did they collapse in '98? Because people were no longer confident of their ability to raise money. Your debt becomes unsustainable at the moment you lose confidence. And that confidence is what we're going to come back to in a moment, because confidence in a world where governments have made too much promises is going to be a commodity that's going to be in short supply. Now, what am I talking about when I say unsustainable? Number one, debt. We are in the end of the debt super cycle. My friend Martin Barnes and before him, Tony at Bank Credit Analyst were talking about this. But Irving Fisher was talking about what we could interpret as the debt super cycle back in the 30s. When governments borrow too much money and don't have the ability to pay it back, when those debts build up, when you borrow from the future to consume today, eventually you get to a place where it's too much. If you borrow to invest in infrastructure, to invest in things which are going to produce income, well, that's good, because that's going to create growth. But when you're borrowed to consume, when you borrowed to give from you to give to him, he likes it, but eventually you want to get your money back. And if you have to tax Tor to get it, eventually Tor's going to go, you know, I think I've had all this pleasure I can stand. I don't want to tax anymore. I don't want to pay anymore. This is too much. That's what happens in societies. We've seen this happen roughly 200 times, almost 250 times in the last few hundred years. Governments come to their end of the ability to raise money at rates that they can finance. It shouldn't be a shock that Greece had to default. I mean, 4 years ago, I was writing that Greece was going to default, and people said, "Oh, John, you're such a bear. Greece is a civilized country. They could never default." Well, yes, if you borrow too much money, you can default. Spain is going to default. Why? Because they don't have enough money to be able to pay back their debt. The only equation that works is if they reduce the value of that debt. Somebody's going to lose. Now, you can do that a lot of ways. You can just print the money and drive the value of the debt down. Okay, that means everybody in the Eurozone will have to pay. That means the kroner will go up because the euro will go down. You can just outright default on it, which is, I think they'll probably take some kind of haircut, or they'll extend the debt. But the people who lent the money won't get the terms that they originally created. Those things are going to have to change. The second thing that's not sustainable, and is even the bigger problem, is the unbalanced entitlement promises, especially health care and pensions. In the United States, we owe roughly $200 trillion that we've committed to pay over the next 30, 40 years, 50 years in entitlement spending. I'm not worried about that at all. It doesn't bother me. $200 trillion? We can't pay it. Why should I worry about that? If you sued me for $1 billion, I would just laugh. You can't get $1 billion from me. Now, the last speaker, maybe you could get $1 billion from him. He would be worried. But me, you can't get $1 billion from me. Now, if you sued me for 100,000, I would be worried, because then I'd know you're serious. You might get 100,000. So you want 200 trillion? You can't get it. The more interesting question is, what happens when the people recognize we can't pay it? That's interesting. Even more interesting, what happens when the market realizes that we can't pay it? Where does that confidence go? Things will have to change. We're going to have to change the conditions that we've agreed to pay entitlements, that we've agreed to pay health care, that we've agreed to pay our pensions. It has to happen. That is going to create upheaval in the economic system far beyond the last fiscal cliff crisis and the next crisis, when we have the debt ceiling crisis and the crisis after that. I think, November we should start thinking about maybe they get something solved. Seriously. It's demographics. We're growing older and there's fewer young people. The most important import, I tell my friends in the United States, that we could do, that we need in the United States, is young people. We should be standing at the borders of every country. Every embassy in the United States should have a sign that says, young immigrants apply here, especially if you have a college degree. Can you speak 5 words of English? Come on. I mean, we need young people. Are you rich and you can buy a house? Bring a friend. I mean, if you have a degree and you get a degree in the United States, we should give you a green card at the same time. Unless you're a lawyer, in which case we don't need you. We have enough lawyers. I mean, you guys, do you have enough lawyers in Norway? We could ship some to you. We should have an immigration policy. We should encourage our lawyers to go. Except for my lawyers, of course. Now, I want to talk about what's not unsustainable. Food is not unsustainable. The world is going to be able to grow more food than we can all eat. The only reason that we have people starving today is because their governments have policies that make it happen. There's plenty of food. We just have to figure out how to grow it and how to get it from where. We're growing twice as much per hectare as we grew 30 or 40 years ago. We're becoming more efficient with water. There's only 4 or 5 places in the world that really have water problems. Now, those places really do have water problems, China being one. I mean, we're becoming better. We're growing more food for less water. We're becoming more efficient with it. We're using less water as a culture, as a civilization. In fact, the more civilized, the more advanced we get, the less water we use. We're not going to run out of energy. We may run out of cheap energy, but we're not going to run out of energy. And the percentage of cost of most products of energy is not that high. We can afford it. The United States will be energy sufficient within 7 to 10 years. I mean, they found 3 more fields underneath the Bakken field in North Dakota. I was just up there flying around 2 weeks ago with a gentleman that was just a country boy from North Dakota. He was either Swede or Norwegian. Way back when. Surin, but he had a piece of the first third oil well in the Bakken, and has a piece of about 20% of the oil wells out there. And there's something like 7,000 oil wells now. They're planning another 20,000 in the next 5 to 7 years. And what they found underneath this vast new supply of oil is 3 more layers of oil underneath it, just as big as the Bakken. And in another part of Texas and Oklahoma, they found the Eagle Ford, which is bigger than the Bakken. And God knows how big the Pennsylvania and New York facility is. Now, we're going to have plenty of energy. I mean, I understand sometimes it's controversial, but we'll figure those things out. That's what humans do. Human adaptivity, the ability for humans to figure out how to survive. I mean, one of the reasons I think that the Norwegians have been so successful in the world is that you have a very harsh climate. You've had to figure out how to survive in Norway. It's not like living in you know, the Caribbean where you just go out and pluck a plant. You've got to work to survive here. But we've adapted. That's what we as humans do. And as things change and as we have new technologies and progress, we'll learn to adapt. That's going to mean growth. That's going to mean potential. So when I talk about unsustainability, I don't want you to think that I'm advocating digging a hole and crawling into it and pulling the dirt around on top of you. It's the wrong thing to do. What you want to do is to get out of the way of governments that are trying to run over you, that are trying to figure out how to take money from here and put it to there. They're wanting to sustain their own abilities to service. That's what governments do. Okay? And we need governments. I'm not an anarchist. I actually, you know, have politicians are my good friends. But you have to understand that they've created policies, good intentions generally, they're unsustainable. Now, where are the current sources of unsustainability for the world? It's in the developed world. Japan, Europe, the United States, perhaps China. Let's start with Japan. I wrote in my book 2 years ago that Japan is a bug in search of a windshield. I think 2013 is the year when we're going to start seeing that trade. I mean, shorting Japanese bonds has been called the widowmaker because people have been trying to short Japanese bonds because they don't make any sense. Japanese debt is anywhere from 220 to 250% of GDP, depending on who you want to believe. It's a stupid number. It shouldn't be able to exist, but it does. It's because they've taken the savings of 2 generations and they've put it into their bonds, mostly through their postal saving systems. Now, the largest postal and pension fund in Japan is beginning to sell bonds because they have people who are retiring and the savings is becoming less than what they need to sell for their retirement. At the same time, they're having a trade deficit and they're getting into a spitting contest, let's say, with the Chinese, who are their biggest customers, which is hurting their exports even more. We're going to see them go into a trade deficit and a savings deficit this year. The central bank has promised, the politicians have promised they're going to take over the central bank, take away the independence, and they're going to print yen. In 2003, I called the Bank of Japan the most incompetent central bank in the world because they could not destroy their own currency. Any other central bank in the world was able to destroy a currency if they wanted to. The Japanese couldn't do that. We're getting ready to get a new generation of Japanese bankers who are going to figure out how to destroy the value of the yen. Shorting yen is the play. Now, I've been saying that for years. Last month and this month, I'm actually putting my money where my mouth is, and I'm putting investments in that are short the yen, short Japan. I'm not wanting to necessarily be long of Japanese stocks. Eventually, we're going to want to be long of Japanese stocks because as they short the value, you want to be able to short the yen and go long Japanese intellectual property companies. Not companies that are going to need to import steel and energy because that costs them money in hard currencies. You want to go long companies that are exporting intellectual property. The Japanese are brilliant at making robots, brilliant at machine tools. They've got they're very, very smart, wonderful companies. And so if you get thinking about how do you play that, you play specific companies in Japan that are going to be able to export intellectual property that's denominated in yen to the rest of the world where they're going to get dollars and euros and kroner. They're going to become very valuable in terms of the Japanese stock market. And if you short the yen and take out the yen trade, there's going to be some value there. The problem is Japan is not like losing Greece. Japan finances much of Asia. That's going to be a problem for cash flows as the Japanese banks begin to have to figure out how to handle their capital issues, and they will have them. As the yen begins to rise, begins to fall in value, the rise in value, it'll go to 100, then 125, then 150, then 200. I remember the yen at 300 in my life. It's going back there. They're committed. And once they start down that path, pulling back is a problem. The only way they pull back is a depression. It's very difficult as a politician to sell a depression to your voters. They're starting down a long, dark spiral. The problem will be if you're Korea, what happens when you can buy a Lexus cheaper than you can buy a Kia? This isn't going to make the Koreans happy. It's not going to make the Chinese happy. We're going to see currency wars the latter part of this decade that are going to make the current currency problems seem like child's play. I'm meeting next week with the gentleman who I co-authored Endgame on, which basically 2 years ago described all of the current problems we're having in Europe and the United States. I mean, you can see these problems happening. You don't know exactly how they'll play out, but it's unsustainable. If something is if it's not sustainable, it's going to change. Think that through. If you don't get anything else out of that, get this today. Well, we're going to start talking about the book we're going to write in 2014 to come out in 2015 on currency wars. Because the latter half of this decade, we're going to see countries worrying about the value of their currency because we're going to have 2 or 3 countries really trying to mess with their currency. Japan messing with its currency the way it's going to is going to create problems and ripples throughout the world. This is from the Bank of International Settlements. It's what would happen in various countries if they don't change their entitlement programs. What happens if they change it a little in the bottom little gray line? It's what happens if they severely restrict. Tell the king to wait on me, okay? What happens if you severely restrict entitlements? Most countries, even under massive austerity, still can't bring their debt to their GDP down. Portugal actually can if they want to, and they're in the process of doing it. Spain, the United Kingdom's got problems. We don't talk about the United Kingdom much. The United States, we still grow to a debt if we have severe limitations, which tells me that debt to GDP ratio of 200% won't happen. We're going to have more than severe limitations. We've got a real day of reckoning coming in the United States. It's going to be difficult. By the way, that excites me. It really does, because it means that the footprint of government is going to have to become smaller. That's good for America in the long term. In the short term, it's a very, very bumpy ride. Now, here's where we want to look. France is going to become the new Greece. Just 4 years ago, I was telling you Greece was going to be a problem. I'm telling you today, France is going to become a problem. Not this year, but probably next year. France will be the real test for the commitment of the Eurozone. How many of you believe that Germany is going to want to bail out France? Anybody? Oh, here we've got a believer. Are you French? By the way, the only good thing that's going to happen out of this entire debt crisis is that the French will finally get theirs. There's just a pleasure in their system is so superior. You know, no, it's not. It's socialism. You cannot have a government where it's 55 and 60% of your GDP. You can't say, well, gee, we think we should retire earlier and give away more money. And no, that doesn't work. The math doesn't work. But, you know, understand, Paris is one of my favorite cities. I love it. It'll always be there. It made it through World War I, World War II. It's gone through, you know, Mitterrand. Paris will be there. It's just going to be a lot cheaper in the future. We should be happy about that. Europe, old Europe, is going to have to figure out how to restructure its entitlements and its promises. They don't have enough young people to be able to pay. Their demographics is shrinking. They don't have a balance in their system. It's unsustainable. Just a thought about austerity. Of course it doesn't work. If by work you mean it's supposed to create growth and prosperity. Duh! You're reducing, by definition, you're reducing GDP. GDP is consumption of business and consumers plus investments plus government spending plus exports. If you reduce government spending, you're by definition going to reduce GDP over the short term. It takes about a year or two and then it all balances out. And so it can't work if what you mean by working is producing growth. The problem is austerity is forced on you when nobody will lend you money. I mean, as long as the Germans are willing to give Greece money, who then turns around and gives it to German banks, I've always thought that was an odd thing. Okay, the Germans, we're going to lend the Greeks money, and they're going to keep 30 billion euros, and then they're going to give it back to German banks. Why don't you just cut the middleman out and give it straight to German banks? But that's the way the Europeans want to do it, and, you know, I'm from Texas, so what do I know? Austerity isn't going to work, but it's going to be necessary because you cannot spend more than you bring in an income that other people were paying for. Doesn't work. Eventually, you have to figure out how to balance your system. I'm going to go to Greece next week. Spend 4 days. I'm meeting with businesses and politicians, trying to figure out what it looks like. How do you adjust? Where are the opportunities there? When you have chaos like that, I have friends of mine that went to Argentina right after the last crash in 98, 99, 2000, and they bought land and apartments, and they made out like bandits, but they bought at the bottom. They bought in the middle of chaos. So don't think of that chaos as, oh, this is terrible. Think of it as opportunities. Now, the last bit of problem is the one bubble to rule them all. And that's the bubble of U.S. entitlement spending, U.S. entitlement guarantees our debt. Can't happen. That's what it looks like. That's what our expenditures, at some point, the markets are going to say to us no. Now, I think it'll be 2014, 2015, if we don't solve our deficit problem, if we don't solve it this year. I've met with lots of Republican leaders, lots of Democrat leaders in the House and in the Senate. They understand the problem. They don't agree how to fix it, but they understand the problem. They know the math doesn't work. They know they've got to put our country on a sustainable deficit path back to where we're balancing the budget. If we don't do it, then the markets are going to look at Japan falling away, look at Europe cratering in various countries, and they're going to say to the United States, you know, we've seen this movie twice before. We know how it ends, and if you don't mind, we'd like to leave at intermission. Normally, the United States would go to 2018, 2019, we are the world's superpower, we are the reserve currency. But the markets are going to watch the rest of the world have problems, and they're going to see the same math. Now, if we put ourselves on a sustainable path to a balanced budget, the United States will once again deserve to be the reserve currency of the world, rather than being the prettiest girl in an ugly contest, which is what we are today. I mean, do you want to make the yen your reserve currency? The euro? Are you excited about the British pound? Does that give you warm fuzzies? I mean, the Norwegian kroner would be the answer to the world, I'm telling you, if you just would print more of them. The world needs Norwegian kroners. Now, real quickly, we have a massive global demographic change coming. It's creating an unsustainability in the world, in that we're going to end up with not enough young people. China, in 15 years, falls off a demographic cliff because of their one-child policy. They're beginning this year to have fewer workers that to support older people, and in 15 years it just becomes a cliff. We've never seen anything like it in the history of the world. We've never seen Japan. Japan is a slow-moving. They're just rolling down the hill. China's going to fall off. And it'll be interesting to see what happens as an academic and as, a historian looking back 100 years from now. Going through it is going to change consumption patterns. It's going to change a lot of things about how countries interplay. What we've got is a great experiment. We're debating the theories of 4 dead white guys. Keynes and von Mises, that's supposed to be a laugh line, guys. Keynes and von Mises and Fisher and Friedman. Keynes and the Keynesians say consumption is important. Von Mises, Hayek would answer, no, it's income. Income is more important than consumption because income is what produces the ability to consume. The Keynesians say, no, we should have the government spend money to keep consumption up. And then when the markets are good, then we should pay the debt back, which is what Keynes actually said. They forgot the second part where Keynes said, oh, you're supposed to pay the debt back when times are good. We never got around to that. Just that small detail. I think for the rest of this decade, and maybe for the part of it after that, is we're going to see 2 other economists come to the forefront. Hyman Minsky, who should have gotten a Nobel Prize, and I'm saying that to the people that are supposed to be paying attention about Nobel Prizes, who gave us the instability hypothesis, that stability breeds instability, that the longer things stay stable, the more instability is produced in the system, and the greater the bubble, the bursting of the bubble will be. One of the great economic minds of the last century. When we see governments try to protect people from change, when governments try to keep things stable rather than allowing little breaks, little things to happen, to keep, to try to protect fragility, then you bring these stable times. People think things are going to be the same because that's what we humans do. We project yesterday into tomorrow. We assume it's a linear progression. That's not. It's when confidence erodes, we have a bang moment. And we've seen it happen 250 times in the last few hundred years. When people no longer have confidence in government debt, and that government loses its ability to borrow money. It's happened to Spain, I think, 17 times. We should not be shocked that the Spanish are going to default again. They're professionals. They're good at it. Okay? The second economist that's going to become important is Schumpeter. And what Schumpeter gave us was the concept of creative destruction. Is that the forces of change, competition, would create this massive creation of growth and prosperity, but in the process, what didn't adapt, what didn't transition, would fall by the wayside. We are getting ready to go into what I call the millennium wave. It's the period of the greatest transformation and change in the history of the world. We're going to see multiple waves of change all coming together over the next 20 years. It's going to be as if electricity and the steam engine and the car and telecommunications and the internet were all invented at once. It's going to create more change in the next 20 years than we saw all of last century. Compressed. And businesses are going to have to adapt and transform, take a quick breath, and adapt and transform again. That's a good thing. It creates opportunity. What we will learn is that the most important piece of capital for any business is not the steel, it's the place between the ears of their employees. That's what has to be nurtured. That's what we have to try to help grow and transform, because that's how you adapt. When you are looking for companies, when you're looking for the transition from unsustainability to sustainability, because that's what Minsky taught us, you go from stability to instability, which is where we are today, and you go back to stability. You have that transition. Things can't stay unstable forever. We're going to another stable period. By the way, when we get to that stable period, I don't want to steal my thunder. What you want to do, is avoid what is negatively affected by the unsustainable and choose what is sustainable. Makes sense? We're trying to go from today through a period of instability to a period of stability. What gets us there? We're looking for companies. We're looking for investments that serve basic human needs. I can guarantee you that in 10 years, 15 years, 30 years, we're still going to eat. Call me stupid, but we're going to want to eat food, and we're probably going to want more protein, and we're going to want better food, and we're going to want it cheaper, and we're going to want to figure out how to get it to more people. We're going to want clothing. The French will still be able to design, the Italians will still be able to design, the Chinese will still buy it. We're going to want housing. We may even need social networks. And because, what's a social network? It's part of our evolutionary process. 100,000 years ago, we learned to communicate sitting around a fire on the African savannah, talking to each other. It's an innate human need. We get endorphin rushes. We get chemical signals to our brain when we communicate. What do our kids do today? They sit around the text and they get pleasure from that little text. Thumping away. That's how they communicate. That's their equivalent of sitting around the fire. Now, that will change. 15, 20 years from now, our kids won't be texting, they'll be thinking. We'll have vast artificial intelligence structures between us and the internet, determining what it is that we need, pushing the information together, looking at us constantly as our entire lives become part of the cloud. That worries some of you, doesn't it? It shouldn't. I'm looking forward to it. Because when the internet becomes intelligent enough to know what it is that I need before I need it, I'm happy about that. That's called service. I like it when I go into a hotel, like I did last night, And I don't know whether it was just, coincidence or whether you arranged a tour, but there was Texas bluegrass music playing on my TV. I walk into the bar and there's Johnny Cash. Life is good. I mean, last night they had a special dinner, and they had 21 beautiful Norwegian young ladies come out and sing, and they were singing 30s and 40s Broadway musicals, the stuff that I grew up with. That's what my dad and mother listened to. And I actually got nostalgic last night, thinking about growing up in West Texas, listening to Broadway music, listening to in Norway in English. It was very, very nice. But it's that part of that, it's that communication. It's the anticipation of what I want to, what I expect. It makes you feel good. That's going to happen. That's part of the communications. What's sustainable? Companies that are adaptable and anti-fragile. There's a book that's just been written by Nassim Taleb called The Anti-Fragile. I suggest you read it. I'm halfway through it. It's an important book. I don't particularly like him. I read the book and I go, I don't want to meet this person. Rajat, the speaker here earlier, said, John, he says, I had the same sense when I read his book, The Black Swan, that here was a man that had a good idea, but I didn't want to actually meet him. And then I met him. And it just confirmed that I didn't want to meet him. But he's a thinker. And he causes you to think. And what he points out is that we need to allow the fragile to break, and we need the anti-fragile, which takes everything you throw at it, it absorbs it, and uses it to grow. Technology does that. Communications does that. We want to find things that will create ever more abundance at lower cost and higher productivity. What will do that? Biotechnology, robotics, nanotechnology. I am a big bull on biotechnology. It's going to be the next bull market. It's going to be the next bubble. Why will it be a bubble? Because we're going to have a half a dozen companies go from $1 to $1,000 because they will have created things that will be staggering in their implications for humanity. And then it'll be just like gold stocks in the 1980s. Do you remember Vancouver, the gold stocks? You're almost old enough to remember, Tor. What was it in Vancouver? A gold mining company became a hole in the ground with 4 guys standing around it saying, this hole in the ground looks just like Newmont, just like Barrick. And if you'll invest in this stock before we drill, you're going to go 1,000 to 1 too. And a biotechnology company by the end of this decade will be a test tube with 4 guys standing around it in white smocks, and they'll be saying, this test tube looks just like that test tube that went to 1,000. Because that's what humans do. We're going to miss the greatest wave, and it'll become a bubble. So I'm trying to invest in biotechnology today, because just once in my life, dear God, please, I want to be at the beginning of a bubble. I'm invested in a company, it's a private company, and this is actually serious. June, July, August, we'll be in human trials. Fluke discovery of a molecule that in mice kills every cancer it comes in contact with. Goes through the blood-brain barrier. It's being fast-tracked by the FDA. We'll be in human trials. By the end of the year, we'll begin to know if we've got something that could be a relatively cheap cure with no side effects for cancer. Wouldn't that be cool? There's another company that's developing a cure for viruses. The day will come, not too far into the future, when you get a virus, you're going to go to your local pharmacy, you're going to buy a patch, slap it on your arm, and it'll be gone in 24 hours. AIDS is a virus. Shingles is a virus. There's all sorts of things that are viruses. There'll be things of the past, perhaps, by the end of the decade. I have a friend that somewhere in Asia, in a country to be named later, will be taking your blood cells, turning them into young blood cells, or stem cells, and or you can take your skin cells or your hair or whatever, and he's going to turn it into artery cells. And he's going to give you a brand new artery system with a 100-year warranty. That'll be cool. And then you go to the next organ and the next organ. These things are happening today. And they're happening in labs, in hundreds of labs all over the country. New liver, new skin, it's all happening. There's a revolution coming outside of what government is doing. And that's where the opportunity is. You have to look and say, where are the things that we're going to want in 5 years or 10 years? We're going to want health. We're going to want food. There are places to go and funds and companies that can get you from where we are today to where we're going to be, and people are going to want those products. They're going to want those services. This is an exciting time. It's a difficult time. I get that. It's not the 1950s. Thank God it's not the 1950s. What would I do without a cell phone? I got to have PowerPoint to be able to do a speech. No, this is a good time, and it's a wonderful world. Thank you very much.
Questions for John?
I see that hand back there.
Just a question. Do you think that Europe can reverse the negative spiral in which they're in now if they come together as a union? They are forming a union in order to loan money, every country at the same rate, maybe in 1 or 2 years. Would that fix France's problems?
France's problems are that they're spending more, and they've obligated them to spend more than they possibly can have. They've already got government as too big a portion of their GDP. They're going to have to retrench. And they'll hit a wall. And I mean, they survived Mitterrand. It's like the United States. We got through Jimmy Carter, and we're still a republic. Okay? Governments, democracies can do these things. But it's not going to be without pain for the French people. So I don't want to be, I don't want to be too, the French are easy to make fun of, okay? Let's face it. But it's going to be tragic for people. Their farmers are going to lose their subsidies. I know that. Why do I know that? Because there are more old people than there are farmers, and that's where the vote is. And old people are going to vote to keep their pensions, and they'll give up the farm subsidies. It's going to be a slow spiral. The French are just going to have to retrench. They're going to have to learn that they can't retire at 60 years old. By the way, guys, have you noticed that people who retire die? There's a relationship there. Don't retire. Keep working. The European Union can make it if they want to. They're going to have to learn. They've done it backwards. They became a monetary union before they became a fiscal union. Okay, it's one way to try to do it. Maybe not the best way. I hope the European Union survives. I really do. It's much better for the world if it works. It's going to take some pain. Somebody's going to have to spend an awful lot of money to pull everything together. There's going to be a lot of losses in the bond market. Banks are going to become a problem. When France has a problem, that means their French banks are going to have a problem. That's tough on global trade because they fund global trade, which, by the way, is an opportunity for Norwegian banks. You should go buy the trade units of a SKAGEN and Bank Paribas. Somebody could do that. You guys have got enough money. Next question. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
We're ending the session with addressing investment strategies for 2013 and beyond. And to do that, we have Ian McFarlane, who has been with BCA since 2006. Prior to joining BCA, he worked for portfolio management companies as an economist and as a strategist, both in Johannesburg, Hong Kong, London, and New York. McFarlane has experience from almost all asset classes, both in developed markets and in emerging markets. So please, thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I listened to John with great interest. I always feel so innovative and so full of life and positivism about the future after I've listened to him talking. He described himself as a realistic optimist, which I found somewhat of a contradiction in terms. The only sure thing in life is we're born and we die, and therefore kind of how you can be a realistic optimist is a bit difficult to understand. But putting that aside, I agree with most of what he sort of said. But what I'd like to do in the time available for me today is to talk a little bit about the outlook for 2013, but to try and put 2013 in a longer term context. I love collecting economic statistics and storing them in my memory and then spewing them out in front of audiences. And the one statistic which I have actually been focusing on for some time is something called the Gini coefficient, which measures the gap between the rich and the poor. And that Gini coefficient in the United States now is the highest level it's been since the 1920s. So think about that. We've had a huge amount of economic growth, but the gap between the rich and the poor has got bigger. Now, the conservative mind would tell you, but that doesn't matter because everybody's richer. But some recent research which has been done shows that it does matter. It's not about being a socialist, it's not about being a conservative. It's about the way we think and function as human beings. Something called the neighborhood effect. They did a survey and they asked people, if you were to be given a 10% salary increase, or if your neighbor was to become 10% poorer, what would motivate you more? And guess what? The neighbor becoming 10% poorer would motivate the individual more. So we now understand that what motivates us is actually our positioning relative to those people around us. And that's what I find so frightening about what's going on right now. But for all the economic growth we've generated, that gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, has got bigger. And that is the long-term dynamic which I think is going to shape market behavior and shape the way we think about the world politically, socially, and economically over the next couple of decades or so. And we have to locate what's going to happen in 2013 within that context. A little bit later, almost contemporaneously with that, a famous author appeared on the scene called F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was a Princeton graduate, and he wrote very deeply and very movingly about the problems and the way of life of the rich during the 1920s, the Jazz Age. And he had a great saying, and the saying was, the test of a first-rate intelligence is to keep two conflicting ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And as an author, what he was talking about was our human trait of trying to simplify everything. The world is a lot more complex than economists, strategists, and commentators would have you believe. This is actually a very well-known heuristic in terms of investment behavior. We tend to make investment decisions on the basis of incomplete information and use our minds to fill up the gaps. Or some of us actually use economists to fill up the gaps for us. And you know how valid and accurate those observations can be. Now, the logical conclusion of this heuristic, where we kind of don't have enough time to fill up the gaps in our knowledge, is to take less investment decisions. The problem with that is that wouldn't justify the financial services industry. And what I'm talking about here is that we try and place everything in a narrative. We try and explain the way markets work in terms of a story. But that story is very often at odds with the reality of what's going on. So what I'd like to do today is to start with a story which was articulated by George Orwell, who wrote a famous book called Animal Farm. And in his book, Animal Farm, he talked about this farm where the animals actually overthrew the humans and they began to run the farm. And the first mantra they had after they'd overthrown the humans was 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Time went on a little bit further, and the second mantra they had was all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The pigs came to the fore and they ran the show. Eventually, the pigs made a right pig's mess of it, pardon the fun, and they were overthrown and the humans came back. Now just remember that story as I go through my presentation today, because I think it's a pretty apt metaphor of what's going on in the financial markets right now. So let me start with the following observation. If you have a 5-year view on the world, I think it is right to be exceptionally bullish and positive about the outlook for equity markets. But the missing part of the jigsaw puzzle is the artificially low level of interest rates. And before you can transition to a better, more sustainable return on risk assets, you need interest rates to normalize. And history shows that when interest rates normalize, it's normally a very uncomfortable period. But once you get through that, the outlook for equity markets gets much better. So observation number 1, therefore, is I'm positive about the outlook for risk assets. Observation number 2 is over the next 3 to 6 months, the shorter term time horizon, I think it would be right to be much more optimistic about the outlook for emerging market risk assets than it will be about developed market risk assets. In other words, the exact reverse of what we experienced over the last 12 or 15 months. And the third thing I want to say is that we are in a bubble as far as interest rate product is concerned. And bubbles are not the exception in economic history, they're the norm in economic history. Those who embrace bubbles normally make a lot of money. The greater fool theory applies equally to those who sell too early as those who sell too late. If you had sold out in 1999, you would have missed a huge amount of return. Of course, we all hope that we're going to be the person who jumps out of that train just before it hits the buffer, but that story is for another day. So 3 key points then. Anchoring the view about 2013 is if you take a long enough time frame, the outlook for equity markets is very positive. Number 2, over the next 3 to 6 months, it's going to be right, I think, to be overweight in emerging market risk assets versus developed market assets. And number 3, and this is the key thing which underpins everything I'm going to say today, is that we're in a bubble as far as interest rate product is concerned, and that bubble has got a lot further to go. So what I'd like to do today then is to make the following assumptions. That over the next 5 years, we're going to go from what has been an equity bear market to an equity bull market. Since March of 2000, if you've been investing in US bonds and equities, you would have done about 45 percentage points better by investing in bonds relative to equities. And that's going to change, it's going to mean revert, and over the next decade, it's going to be equities which outperform bonds. And the second point I'm going to make is that since 1982, you have been in a secular bull market in bonds. If you have been investing in a mutual fund in the United States, quarter in, quarter out, that letter dropped through the letterbox, you opened it up and you'd made money. For 30 years, you haven't known what it feels like to lose money. What happens that one day when that letter drops through the letterbox and you've lost money? Let's put it in context this way. I'm going to be talking about 3 time frames today. The longer term 1 to 3 to 5 year view of the world, which is essentially your benchmark, what you tend to sort of allocate around, which is the bullish part of what I'm going to say today. The tactical view of the world, which we can dispense right up front. Just basically, the next 3 months is going to be driven by concerns about the US fiscal cliff. Markets are going to be extraordinarily volatile and very confusing. And the part which I'm going to spend most time talking about today, which is 2013, which is a cyclical view of the world, the 3 to 12 month view of the world, and that 3 to 12 month view of the world is actually driven by 3 components. What I think about value, which is okay, what I think about liquidity, which is exceptionally positive, and what I think about growth, which is questionable. The reason why I like China is I think the growth surprise over the next 12 months will come from